the sufficiency, that word sounds so lame in this circumstance, but community sovereignty.
There you go.
Working for those issues for a long time, and I first met Thomas 14 years ago as part of a specific anti-corporate campaign that was in the Pacific Northwest, and the meeting itself, maybe 8 or 10 of us, was pretty good in general. But do you remember when we walked out by ourselves for about 10 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was. God, I hope you don't mind that I say this, but the first chance we got to chat privately, basically I said, "What are you out for?" And
money.
Yeah.
Wrong place.
Yeah, that was a different conversation. And he just said simply revolution. And so I think he's been one of the most strongest, most outspoken of our modern revolutionaries. And I don't mean that in a green capitalist sense. I mean an anti-capitalist sense. So, first question. Well, first, why don't you tell me about the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and then talk about how it's transitioned from what it was doing to what it is doing.
Sure. We started out as a conventional, traditional environmental law firm back in 1995. And we essentially framed the problem when we were created as not enough lawyers doing environmental work. So, for example, you'd have community groups all across the United States who go to see a lawyer when something's coming into their community, like a toxic waste incinerator or a landfill or a factory farm or something that the community doesn't want. And these folks find a lawyer generally because they're sent into a system where they need a lawyer to appeal a permit or work within a regulatory agency or something like that. And lawyers generally run nowadays $400 an hour to even sit down with you and talk things over. And so at that point we said to ourselves, we have the best environmental laws in the world. That's what we said to ourselves, at least. And the only problem is that the reason why things are getting worse is because there's not enough enforcement of those environmental laws happening. And so we wanted to add a couple more lawyers to the rolls. Just to give people an idea, in Pennsylvania, before we began, there were only 10 full-time public interest environmental lawyers in the state. And in the United States today, there's only 200. Slightly over 200 full-time public interest environmental lawyers in the United States. And so we wanted to add some capacity. And so we created a law firm to provide free legal services to community environmental organizations. And as you can imagine, when you hang out your shingle and it says free legal services, people line up around the block, and that's what happened. And pretty soon we had over 300 groups in Pennsylvania that were contacting us to have us represent them in what I would call conventional environmental law matters, like appealing a permit that had been issued by the state for 10,000 head hog factory farm, that kind of thing. And the reason why we started to change, and the reason why we're here and met Derek, is that the communities that were contacting us, when we picked up the phone to answer it from the communities, they would say to us, we don't want this toxic waste incinerator in our community. We don't want this factory farm. It's not our idea of sustainable agriculture. We don't want this landfill. It's not our idea of sustainable waste management. And we were in the curious position, which most environmental lawyers are, of saying to them, well, we're sorry. The law doesn't allow you to say no at the local level. And that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, because people say, well, of course we govern our own communities. We're self-governing. We make the rules in our municipalities. And the answer is, well, not quite. Over the past 100 years, there have been several legal doctrines that have been built into place to divest you, to strip you at the municipal level of actually frontally saying no to certain things. And those certain things are defined as legal uses, L-E-G-A-L. So, for example, if a community wanted to pass a one-paragraph ordinance that says no big box stores in a certain city, the first thing that happens is you get sued by Costco or Walmart, one of the big box companies, who sue the municipality not only to overturn the ordinance that you've just passed, but to sue you for damages for violating the corporation's constitutional rights, because corporations have constitutional rights in this country, and that's one of the pieces that we work on. And so this idea of self-governance is really a myth at the municipal level. They'll let you pass weed ordinances, and how often you have to mow the lawn in certain parts of the community. But when you get to the real stuff, like trying to make democratic decisions about transportation and agriculture and energy, the really big things, what you find is that the system has insulated the corporations that make those decisions on your behalf from any kind of community democratic control. And so being on the receiving end of these communities calling us, we would say, well, you can't say no. But what you can do is appeal the permit that's been issued by the state. You can argue over wetlands and setbacks and loading dock hours and lighting from the Walmart facility coming in. You can argue about all those little things. But one thing you can't do is pass an ordinance or make a decision that frontally says no to one of those legal uses coming in. And our evolution started at that point, because most conventional environmental lawyers get on the phone and that's where they stop. Is they say, well, you can't do that and we'll help you do the permit stuff. We started getting asked some really difficult questions from those community groups, which was the question of why. Why can't we say no, right? If we know our community is going to be devoured by a Walmart coming in, our downtown is going to be vacuumed up by a Walmart coming in, why can't we say no to big box stores in our community? And people that were building viable downtown said, what's the point? We can spend 10 years building a viable, livable downtown, but if we can't say no to Walmart coming in the community where we live, and then the Walmart devouring our downtown, what's the point? What's even the point of envisioning what we want our community to look like if we have no control over what happens next? And it was that question of why from those communities that actually had us look at ourselves pretty deeply, almost shut our office down, because in reality we were doing permit appeals that were doing nothing else than helping corporations build better permit applications to actually get these things put into communities, which is part of that regulatory system that we started to work outside of. And I have to say, the last 10, 12 years have been the most exciting work we've been involved in. But in essence has started with that question of why, and then started to peel back the whys. Because it turns out you're on the receiving end, all of us are, in our communities, of about 140 years of constitutional law that's been concocted to do one thing, which is divest us of governing authority. And I'm fascinated at conferences. Derek and I were talking about this the other day, about going to these conferences. And we censor ourselves, because you go to the conference and water activists go into one room and timber activists go into another room, and we sector off by issue, when it doesn't really matter what the issue is. It's all got a common denominator, which is we don't make decisions about almost anything in this country. And in fact, some people start talking in a very real way at the community level, whether red or blue communities, that we don't have a democracy functioning here. And so we try to peel that stuff back, and then we start working with communities to start passing ordinances at the local level that actually challenge the whole enchilada. And so that was the beginning stages of where we ended up.
And so can you talk about what you're doing now, like the townships in southwestern Pennsylvania? And
yeah, starting in 1998, we had a full-scale invasion of central Pennsylvania by the 4 agribusiness corporations that control about 60% of pork production in the United States. 4 companies control 60% of pork production. It's no different with chicken production. 4 companies control close to 70% of chicken production. 2 companies own 60% of cheese production in the United States. I mean, it's a very corporatized agricultural industry that we have operating in the United States today. Those 4 corporations began coming into central Pennsylvania to set up these 5,000 to 10,000 head hog factory farms in central Pennsylvania. If they move in next to you, you lose about 3/4 of your property value overnight. Not to mention the odor and the air pollution, water pollution, all the other things that come with factory farms. And the companies are always very smart. I mean, they're much smarter than us in a lot of ways. In that when they came into Pennsylvania, they found a weird situation, which was we have about 1,400 local governments, rural local governments in the state of Pennsylvania, and about 100 of those had adopted really strict regulatory laws that made it very expensive for these agribusiness factory farms to get rid of their liquid manure. Not to get too deep into that, we are after lunch, so that's okay. But these facilities produce large amounts of manure. You got to pay to put it somewhere. And these municipalities put very stringent controls on it to make it too expensive to bring the factory farms in. What the agribusiness corporate boys did was they went to the legislature and they got a bill written called the Nutrient Management Act. Right? It sounded really good. All the environmental groups were in favor of it, blah, blah, blah. It's basically a planning law. So if you want to put a factory farm in, all you have to do is file a plan with the state as to how you're going to deal with the manure. And that would automatically preempt all of the local laws that have been passed by the municipal governments, right? This isn't a strange scenario. It happens every day. It's these state legislative tools used to preempt municipalities and people within those communities from actually making law that binds. And so those communities started contacting us because the corporations started to set up shop after that preemption law went through. And those communities started calling us and said, we don't want these factory farms in our community. They're bad for our farmers, they're bad for people living in the community, they're bad for a number of reasons, a very comprehensive problem statement. And they came to us and we said, well, you can't do anything about it because the state has preempted you from doing something, the state legislature. And they would turn to their municipal lawyer, and the municipal lawyer would say, yeah, you passed the law, but it's not worth the paper it's written on because the state legislature has now passed the preemption law and you're screwed. We were in a period of time where we were beginning to re-examine our work, and we decided to do something different, which was to turn our back on the regulatory system, which is in essence a script that's written for communities to follow. So for example, when you challenge housing developments in the state of Pennsylvania, the development corporations are the ones that wrote the municipality's planning code, under which you're then fighting. And so the agribusiness law was written by the agribusiness corporations. And if we think that there's any remedy under those regulatory systems which have been written by the corporations that ostensibly that they're supposed to regulate, we're the crazy ones. And our activism for the past 50 years has been based on that regulatory model that's been written by someone else. And yet we expect things to get better. And in reality, of course, by almost every environmental standard, things are worse today than they were 40 years ago. There's something about our work that isn't working, right? And so we turned our back on the regulatory system. We said, we're not going to argue about manure permits, which is basically where you end up, because the law that allows the permitting of factory farms in Pennsylvania is all about amount of manure you can spread per acre of land, right? And so you go into court, and you have your expert on manure, because you can only talk about manure, right? You can't talk about the fact that suicide among farmers is now the #1 cause of death for farmers in the United States as of 2006, a non-natural death. You can't talk about that. You stand up and you say, Your Honor, I'd like to talk about that here in this administrative hearing room, and he'll say, shut up, sit down, you're out of order, and there'll be objection to that. Can't get it in, because the only conversation you can have is what's been scripted for you by the state regulatory scheme, which is about manure. And so the Sierra Club, they'll come in, they have their manure experts. The corporate boys bring in their manure experts. They have a manure argument in front of the judge. And then the judge issues a manure decision, which most of them have been manure decisions. But it's all scripted. It's all played out because it's written for us. And we gladly go to the slaughter. In these things we teach called democracy schools. We have the regulatory system as this inverted triangle. And at the bottom, it's like cattle down a chute, and you get the bolt shot through your head because you may be able to resist for a year or 2 or 3, but if you're fighting under that regulatory structure, you're automatically going to lose because you didn't write the script. Someone else wrote it. And it's why our activism has become so predictable, at least in environmental arenas, over the past 20 or 30 years, because we expect a different result hammering out under the same script each time. That's the definition of insanity, is to expect a different result from that process. And so, anyway, to make a long story longer, so we turned our backs on that. We went and we said, what else is there? Well, the problem seemed to be not manure, although that's a piece of it, right? I mean, the problem is odor and water pollution. That's all pieces of it. But there's a bigger problem, which is the corporatization of agriculture, which is we don't make decisions about what agriculture looks like. There's a small number of people within corporate boards who made a decision that we're going to have vertically integrated livestock production. That's where the factory farms come from. That's the decision-making structure. And if you look at it, transportation, energy, agriculture, no different. There's a small number of people within the corporate form, a minority, making decisions about what industry is going to look like over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. And so we started doing research. Lo and behold, 9 states in the Midwest didn't know this until we tripped across it. 9 states in the Midwest had said something similar, which was the problem's not manure or odor, the problem is the corporatization of agriculture. That is somehow this control is now decision-making authorities vested in this relatively small number of corporations and people. And they passed these glorious things called anti-corporate farming laws, which banned corporations from engaging in farming within those states. And more amazing to me, in South Dakota and Nebraska, these farmers coming together with environmentalists, coming together with community groups, actually drove it into their state constitutions in Nebraska and South Dakota, right? The amazing thing, without any proof of authority, we went in and stole the South Dakota model. We took it, we wrote it into an ordinance, and we started having it passed. We worked with communities in Pennsylvania who started passing these ordinances at the local level that banned corporations, certain corporations, not family corporations, but the big guys, from coming in and setting up shop with factory farms within those communities. And that's where everything started. That was the shot heard around Pennsylvania, because up until then, the corporate boys were walking in and shoving communities at will. And now there was something different cooking. And it was those communities beginning to combine with another set of communities dealing with sewage sludge. Once again, it's after lunch, but sewage sludge produced by sewage treatment plants. In the United States, 60% of that is applied to land. It's got 300,000 different contaminants in it. We've had 2 kids in Pennsylvania die from being exposed to it. It's a dangerous substance. It's spread on land. Some communities said, hey, we don't want that. And they contacted us and said, hey, we've been following what you did with factory farms. Can you work on sludge issues? And we said, sure. And so we drafted up anti-corporate sludging laws, because it turns out 4 corporations control 80% of the sludge industry in the United States. And so those communities started passing ordinances, and pretty soon we had 100. We had 100 communities, about 10% of all the rural communities in Pennsylvania, that had passed these ordinances. And it was then that things started getting really interesting, because things started to ramp up. Because in conversations with communities, they started talking about things like corporate rights. And it didn't just come out of the blue, because some communities were being sued by the agribusiness corporations, saying that the anti-corporate farming laws violated their equal protection constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Just to break that apart, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution says you and I have due process and equal protection rights. Equal protection means you can't treat persons different from other persons. The agribusiness corporations came in and said you can't pass these anti-corporate farming laws because they treat corporations, which are persons under the law, treated by the law for constitutional rights purposes, differently from family farmers. And therefore you're acting unconstitutionally when you ban corporate farms but support family farms. To which some of our folks started saying, well, what the hell, why do anything at all if our value systems are being controlled by this level of law that punishes us for actually preferencing one sane, sustainable form of agriculture over another one that's insane and illogical and has damages to the community? And it was that point that things started growing, because folks started wanting to have a conversation about why corporations had those rights in the first place. How did corporations get them? Why did they have them? And that led to the first community in Pennsylvania passing an ordinance that we drafted for them that refuses to recognize that corporations have constitutional rights in the municipality. And some people say, well, what's the point? You know, of course municipalities, you can't as a community reverse the US Supreme Court and overturn federal law. To which I say, what the hell else are they supposed to do? And what's needed is people say, who cares what those legal doctrines are? We have to reverse them, because unless we reverse them, we're always under the thumb of some higher decision makers about what sustainability is going to look like in our community, or whether we're even going to have it at all. And so right now what's happening is those ordinances are spreading. You know, we're working in New Mexico and California and Washington State, in Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Maine, where Nestle Corporation's trying to pull out 300,000 gallons of water from the aquifer daily to put in a bottling operation in those places in New Hampshire and Maine. And I guess all this work starts with a single issue. We've been working on single issues for our entire lives, you know, in some places for 50 years. And we're not getting anywhere. Things are getting worse. And we're at the, you know, I'm tired. I guess I got tired of waiting for some kind of mass collective consciousness to change things automatically. And so we started forcing the issue, which was communities understand. They understand a lot better than the liberal progressive groups that we deal with. Liberal progressive groups sometimes aim to work within the existing structure without moving outside it to attack it. So when we first started doing this work, the Sierra Club came to us and said, you got to stop. You got to stop doing this work because you're closing our window to do the regulatory stuff about odor and water and those issues. I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, this is about self-determination. It's about those kinds of issues. And most of our work started in what most people would say red communities, conservative type communities, National Rifle Association members, folks that still had some semblance of what sovereignty means and self-determination. Since spread to a bunch of other communities. But you know, we have 120 communities in Pennsylvania now that have adopted these ordinances and are frontally challenging that corporate power thing. And just a couple weeks ago, somehow, some way, the city of Pittsburgh, block of city council members approached us. In Pennsylvania, we have drilling, natural gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale Formation, where they do something called fracking. They use large amounts of water to actually break open the limestone to pull the gas out. And then they jettison the water into a nearby tributary. Usually it's filled with all kinds of chemical contaminants. They want to drill in Pittsburgh, in the city, underneath some cemeteries in the city to get the gas out. And it looks like in the first part of November, City of Pittsburgh may become the first big municipality, major city to pass one of our ordinances and to refute corporate rights as well, because that's part of the ordinances also.
Wow.
And in addition to the depriving corporations of rights, you nasty person, you've also talked of extending rights to non-human entities who are actually alive.
Yeah.
And so can you talk about your work with that?
Yeah, it makes the story, I think, even more fantastic in some ways, because the same rural communities, the conservative communities that we were working with, when we began talking to them about these legal doctrines that stop communities from being able to govern themselves, there's really four doctrines. One is corporate rights, which is not just corporate personhood rights. You know, corporations are persons under the law, but also the Commerce Clause, which pulls commerce issues all the way out to the federal government level and says to the municipality, you can't deal with those issues. So there's other things besides personhood. The second piece is preemption, which we talked about. You know, state and federal government passes preemptive laws that essentially eviscerate municipal communities from being able to pass any laws in that particular area, even if they're more stringent than what the state or federal government has passed. Third one is something called Dillon's rule, which is the flip side of preemption, which says even if you're not preempted, if you're not specifically authorized by the state legislature as a parent to a child, because that's what the relationship is in the law between the state and the municipality, that you can't pass anything unless you're specifically authorized to be able to pass something. So we get attacked on that ground too. But the fourth one, which sounds kind of out of context maybe with the others, because the others are much more specific, is that nature and ecosystems have been treated as property in the United States and the developed, industrialized world back to the 10,000 years ago as property, which means that ecosystems can be owned. So if you have a deed for a 10-acre piece of property in the United States, that 10-acre deed conveys with it the right to destroy the ecosystem that's dependent upon that 10-acre piece of ground, right? So really difficult area to grasp sometimes, but that our law is property law. It's based on property law. It doesn't recognize ecosystems as having independent rights of their own, that their rights in essence are derivative from yours. And one of the bundles of rights with property is the right to destroy the property, right? That's a bundle of rights. We've attempted in this country to build an environmental movement based on that property concept, which has, it's still very controversial to say, but when I go out and give talks, I say there's never been an environmental movement in the United States. There's never been an environmental movement in the United States because movements are about changing things that were treated as property into being rights-bearing entities. The suffragists took women treated as property, and at least for one facet of that, the right to vote, converted women from being property, transformed into rights-bearing entities. The abolitionists It's what the movement for 70 years by the abolitionists about, transforming African Americans from being property into being people. It's what movements do. That's what movements do, because the system wants to make you property. It's automatic under the system that we have. It wants to transform you into property, because property can be used, it can be owned, it's privatized, it's all that stuff that this sick system of ours actually feeds on. And so movements are about taking things that were once property, transforming them into rights entities. We've never done that within the environmental movement. It's never been about rights of ecosystems and the environment. We like to talk sometime about rights, but in essence, the rights are derivative. So in your state constitutions, like Pennsylvania, we have a thing that says you have a right to use nature. It's equal access, equal exploitation of nature. That's in essence what the constitutional provisions are. It's not the same as nature having rights. It's about our equal authority to use nature, and those are two different things. And so a little place called Tamaqua Borough in a place called Schuylkill County, northeastern Pennsylvania, up against dredging. The Rendell administration in Pennsylvania wanted to bring Delaware River dredging full of PCBs and stick it in the abandoned mine holes that are pocket, coal country. So take the good out and put the bad in was in essence what the plan was. And folks in Tamaqua said, well, wait a minute, this is going to affect not just us, the people of Tamaqua, but also the natural environment here. And we engaged them for the first time about what it would look like if ecosystems had rights that could be enforced by the people within the community. And they became the first municipality to adopt an ordinance that declared that ecosystems had the right to exist and flourish, and that individual members of the community had the legal standing to actually enforce those rights. And Tamaqua was the first place where it happened. And now it's in 24 municipalities throughout Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Maine, and Virginia. And the idea spread, and it was our pleasure to work with the Pachamama Foundation, the Pachamama Alliance in Ecuador, to actually meet with their constitutional delegates who were writing a new constitution in Ecuador. And eventually, those rights of nature provisions became part of the new Ecuadorian constitution, which became the first country in the globe to actually move to a rights-based environmental protection system rather than a property-based and regulatory-based environmental protection system. So it was a huge thing. And now we're talking about expanding that as well, but it's a completely different concept than what we're used to talking about, or at least what we were used to talking about, because it's an understanding that ecosystems have independently enforceable rights of their own. And those are defined within the ordinances as they exist and flourish. Other municipalities moved beyond that and actually designated certain ecosystems like rivers and aquifers as having rights to sustainable recharge and to evolve as natural systems. And I guess the way I would group all of this in the end is about self-determination of communities and redefining communities as not just us as humans within a municipality, but redefining community as the natural community's right to self-determine within the community as well. And these ordinances are really self-determination ordinances with an understanding that they have to drive upwards. There has to be 10,000 communities across the United States who have a different vision for what they want their communities to look like, and then push that vision up, because power exceeds nothing without demand. And one thing that's been missing in our organizing is really the power to make that demand. This is about communities coming forward on different issues, different in almost every way, but coming together with a commonality to push that up to the state constitutional level and then to push it up to the federal constitutional level. Because in the end, I think we need a new federal constitution. That's the conclusion we've come to, right? And when people say, we lowered the Constitution, when people say, oh, this is great, what they're talking about is the Bill of Rights, is most times, 99.9% of the time, it's like Constitution, they're talking about the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment. The amendments had to be driven in by the resistance group, which was the anti-federalists, who weren't perfect by any means. They were white men with property too, but had to be driven in against the federalists who were driving in a centralized preemptive federal government system through the U.S. Constitution. And we forget that it was a resistance movement that drove the Bill of Rights in. Most people don't even take time to read what the structure of the text of the Constitution is. There's some really nasty stuff in there about returning freed slaves when they run into states, return of bonded labor, the Commerce Clause, which says if it has anything to do with commerce, you as a community or a state have no authority to deal with it whatsoever. It's the federal government's role only, so it pulls everything out to that level. And it was written in the 1780s, ratified in the 1780s by a bunch of 40 white guys with property who had slaves washing their underwear outside the, place where they were writing the thing. And yet from birth we have this IV drip in our arm that says, this is the founding fathers were the best people ever trod the planet. You ask most people, they say, we're the only country with a constitution, right? I mean, that's what it is. That's what the polls say. I mean, that's what people think. And back then, the founders, I'm rambling, but the founding fathers, they looked out on the continent and they saw an endless bounty of natural resources, right? And they said, the best way for us to become a great nation, and that's the goal of law here, that's the goal of our growth, is to become a powerful, great nation, stand up among those legions, the English and the French, is to put a structure of law in place that allows us to exploit it as quickly as possible, right? That's what the document is, just to be very clear. And it worked. It's worked beautifully to do that. They didn't know about deforestation or global warming or any of these other things. Even if they did, they may not have changed what they did because they were those people. But at the same time, it's time to start talking about what a new structure looks like, a new DNA, because we can work within the existing structure as much as we want, but we bump our heads against it every day, every week, every month. It depends on how much we want to put into trying to go around it, which we've been doing for 50 years, and just to take aim at it and actually fundamentally change it. Because when the folks working against Walmart in communities, they say, we don't want a big box store here, and they rise up, the first thing they run into is not the Walmart corporation. Right. It's not Costco. It's the Constitution they run into. Because the corporations are wielding those constitutional provisions against the communities. And so we got a big job on our hands. But at some point we just said, let's get started with it.
That would be a great place to end, but I have two more questions.
Sure.
One of them is that I hear everything you're saying, and it makes, I love your work, and this all makes sense to me, but given that, all these municipalities can pass these ordinances, but if they're just going to get overturned anyway, and in any case, even if, say, you were able to actually convince every member of the Supreme Court to change the rules on this, the heads of those Supreme Court justices would be on pikes in front of the White House the next week, corporate pikes.
Sure.
So I don't understand why you're doing what you're doing.
Well, we know that. We're not out to convince any of the judges about anything. In reality, when we go into these communities, you have like 2, 3, 4, in the smaller communities, you may have as few as 5. 5 people who something about this work resonates with them. So that when they're contacted by the environmental lawyers, they don't go into the regulatory route. They don't do permit appeals. They say, what's the point? Let's do something different. So people that have freed themselves enough from the culture, which is very pervasive. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about culture. We talked a lot about law, but they're both intertwined. That people are so colonized to think that this is a democracy and that if you mobilize enough people around a good idea, or if enough people want something, that's enough to get it. And of course it's not. And there's a small group of people that usually come forward to say, we need to do something different. The problem is you can't reach the rest of the people. The culture is so solid and so pervasive, they don't hear you. You can go in and say, we don't have a democracy, they say you're crazy. I mean, that's the majority of people, because we've since birth, IV, democracy, it's a great place, and if we lose, it's our fault. I mean, that's basically the guilt complex that's built into us. And so what we do is we work with the community, and they say, yeah, we're a democracy, we're going to pass this ordinance, and we're going to get rid of the big box store, factory farm, or whatever in the community. And they think that they have democratic control, even though we're trying to have a conversation with them about not. What's really the clicker, though, the thing that sends it over, the thing that leverages a new thing to happen, is when the challenge comes in. When Walmart Corporation files a lawsuit, and on page 1 of the lawsuit it says, we, Walmart corporations, are persons under the law, and therefore we have constitutional rights, and you have violated our 14th and 5th Amendment constitutional rights, right? It's on paper. You don't have to believe a Tom Linzey, or a Mari Margill, or a Ben Price, our other organizers, or a Kai Hushka, who's here from Spokane today. You don't have to believe us when we come in and say there's no democracy. It's on paper now, right? It's coming in as the challenge on paper. And so the people in the community say, wow, we heard this before, that we don't have a democracy and that corporations have these rights, but we didn't really believe it. And now it's there, right? It's there, and it's not us telling them, because we're so small. Why listen to us? We're tiny, and we're saying things that they're hearing, the opposite side of, 364 days out of the year, right? Lawsuit gets filed, we come in, the municipality retains us to defend the lawsuit, and we defend the lawsuit in such a way that lends itself to leveraging the organizing. So the briefs are read by the community. And they say, Dillon's rule, what the hell is that? Right? Corporate rights, where did that come from? Right? From the 1840s? Why are we applying it now? Corporations aren't persons under the law, right? And we use that entire process, which is sometimes a year and a half, 2 years, of going through the litigation and the challenge, so that people start getting the veil unwrapped from their head to actually see how the system works. Because we've understood that it's not enough for us to say it. It just glazes, bounces off glazed eyes. You have to use the system to provoke the challenge that proves your theorem. Because it's all about proving the theorem to people. And then the question is, what do they do next? You pass an ordinance, maybe it gets overturned, maybe it goes out the window, whatever. And what we're finding is people are now taking that energy that's been leveraged and actually doing something new, which is upping the ante, which is writing their own constitutions at the municipal level. And there's a home rule process. Some communities are home rule communities. It gives you a little bit more room to roam in terms of writing new home rule charters. Spokane, where we've been working for a while, has a home rule charter, and so our goal is to amend it with a community bill of rights into the city charter itself. And so there's a broader base of activism that starts to happen. And people start working on that broader base, and then in Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, they've started gathering to talk about state constitutional change, right? Because they're saying in their communities, hey, we're working on Walmart, you're working on fracking, you're working on toxic waste incinerators. All the issues have a commonality, which is we don't make decisions about what happens in our community. It's a democracy issue, it's a rights issue. The litigation, the ordinance takes it from being about chemical composition of fracking compounds, which we have whole groups fighting on right now, to being about rights. And whose rights nullify whose? Is it corporate rights that are dominant to the community's rights? Or is it the community democratic majority's rights that are superseding the corporate rights? It's all about using institutions that we know are not going to provide a remedy, to bounce off those institutions, to build an organizing base of people, a critical mass who can then move forward and do some fantastic things. Probably within the next 20 or 30 years, which is the timeline that we have because things move so slowly to cut through the culture crap. But in Pennsylvania, not only did they come together, but they said, our goal is to embed a right to local self-government in the state constitution. And let's get to work on that. Because until that happens, none of our communities are self-governing. So it's about plugging into something more powerful than just chemical mixtures on a fracking project or whatever. It's about finding the juice. And the juice is coming from the single issue battles that are then being reframed into something else, making law, seizing their municipal institutions, and then joining hands to drive that change higher up into state constitutional and eventually federal constitutional frameworks. That's where we think we're headed. And it's about bouncing off those existing institutions to do it rather than turning to them for a remedy, which is what we've done for the last 40 years, is hope and pray that a judge is going to issue something on our behalf when we know that they're not going to, when the structural stuff is at stake. And so it's an organizing process that's now building critical masses of people in those communities.
That seems to answer your last question too, but I'll ask it anyway, which is, what is the new system of law and culture that you envision, and how is this culture of resistance you're helping to build going to get us there?
Yes, it's very slow work. It's very tedious work. It's very difficult work. It's one-on-one. Our organizers are asked to come into communities where the communities want to do something else, and usually it's because the communities have recognized, or a core group have recognized, that it's pointless to go in a standard, conventional, traditional direction. So it's about that new kind of organizing that's happening. I think those frameworks of law that are being passed, that have been passed in 120 different communities now across the United States, are microcosms of what people want the new federal constitution to look like. That's a big, big thing to hold in our heads. But when you look at an ordinance like the one about to be passed in Pittsburgh, for example, it has a Bill of Rights in it. And that Bill of Rights is about a right to a sustainable energy system. It's about a right to clean air and clean water. It's a right for nature to exist within the community. It's the very first sputterings of that, but communities coming forward to draft those ordinances about the vision of what they want their community to be like in 20, 40, or 60 years, which is something that's been eviscerated from us over the past 120. And this concept of becoming self-governing, driving through that process so that those ordinances actually are codifications of those visions that people have for their communities. And what we see now is those ordinances getting much more advanced, and morphing into other places like Ecuador. We're now talking with folks in Nepal and Australia and Mexico and Canada. This rights of nature thing has really piqued people's attention because it's a whole new form of environmental protection that looks different in scope, that's not anthropocentric, it's something much different. And I think it's those that are the microcosms of what a new federal constitution is eventually going to look like. And that's not going to happen overnight. It took us 120 years to get here. It's going to take a while to get back. But what's hopeful to me, because I had given up hope, pretty much, giving up hope, Derek's piece, giving up hope that anybody's going to help these communities. So when we go into the communities, the first thing we say is that there's nobody that's going to help you. Regulatory agencies aren't going to help you. The Sierra Club's not going to help you. The federal regulator's not going to help you. Congress is not going to help you. The state legislature's not going to help you. There's nobody that's going to help you. You can't make a phone call and somebody's going to come in and save you. I mean, it's not going to happen. And so you have to do it yourself. And some communities collapse at that point. They say, well, we can't do it ourselves, and they go away. And so you have to work with a huge number of communities, because only 1 in 10 is powerful enough to fight through the cultural stuff to eventually make law. And that's what we're looking at. In our democracy schools, which are these 2-day training sessions that we run in 24 states across the country, are efforts to find people who can hear this stuff, understand it, and then take action on the basis of it. And I guess we did the democracy schools because I'm tired of going to conferences. I'm tired of going to conferences where people say, well, if you invest in the right stuff, everything will be okay. If you buy the right stuff, everything will be okay. If you invest in it, I'm tired of that. I can't do it anymore. I got to that point. And I'm tired, for the most part, of environmental organizations that constantly work within the regulatory regime and tell our communities you can't do anything else. I'm tired of that too. And I guess I'm tired of a lot of the conventional, traditional activism, which has not gotten us where we need to be. And something, if it's not now, and as Derek writes, about 120 species went extinct today, right? And yesterday. 120 will go extinct tomorrow. I mean, how long are we going to screw around with the scripted stuff that's been written for us so that we're obedient to that script, so that we lose in the long term anyway and spin our wheels and raise money to pay the attorneys to do the regulatory appeals? How much longer are we going to do that, right? Yeah. I've had enough. I mean, I had enough at some point. So let's do it. Let's stop talking about it and let's do it, because doing it is a lot less fearful or scary than talking about it. We talk about it, it becomes so scary. We do it, it's not as scary, right? But the cost of doing nothing is more expensive now than the cost of doing something. We have to do it. And so even if our municipal lawyers, you go to your local towns and cities and say, hey, let's recognize rights for nature in this community. And the lawyer looks at you like you're freaking crazy, right? He says, go home. We don't do that kind of stuff here. Or our hands are tied. We can't tell Walmart you can't come in here. And you tell bullshit, right? I don't think I have to edit that out. But bullshit. Because it's late in the game, right? It's like the 10th inning already. And the score is 3,570 to 0. We haven't even been on the playing field yet. Let's get on the field. Let's take the ball from the other side. Let's at least put up a defense, because for the past 80 years, they've been running it without any defense on the field. They've just been throwing it, kicking it, and it's like 5,000 to 0 right now. Let's at least get on the field and then get beat, okay? You know? Yes, I'm just tired of all of it, and it's time to move.
That's great.
Yeah.
So that was Thomas Linzey.
And just a big thank you to Derek for doing this, especially with, and to the